Unfortunately, we always have a segment of the population of the world viewing everything as a head-to-head competition or something, and that they need to win and someone else has to lose for them to win and that kind of thing,
Yeah.
as opposed to, as the world keeps getting smaller and we keep getting more and more interconnected, it's like at a certain point, can't we see all of humanity as our community and our group that we're wanting to succeed?
Hey gang, I'm Nikki LaCroce, and today I'm sharing the mic with Greg Ripley. Greg's a Taoist priest and forest therapy guide, as well as the author of 100 Remedies of the Tao, Spiritual Wisdom for Interesting Times, and sure to say we are in interesting times. So welcome to the show, Greg. I'm excited to have you here.
Hey, thanks so much, Nikki, for having me.
Yeah. So I would love to kind of dive in a little bit just to start with how you really even found your path to the Tao to begin with.
Yeah, it's one of those that I think, like most people along the way, I felt like I was all over the place. And then in hindsight, a lot of the decisions and a lot of the different influences made a lot of sense together. And
Yeah.
so looking back, I can see how things fit together really pretty well. But
Yeah.
so let's see, I guess, in when I was growing up, I always felt a little bit kind of alienated and outsidery, and so I was in junior high and high school. I was into skateboarding and punk rock and that whole kind of vibe.
I can relate. I didn't skateboard, but I had the vibe.
Yeah, for sure. So it was like, why would I want to play sports? Why would I want to join that club or this club? Or why would I want to do any of that? Like none of that seemed appealing. And so, so I guess I found some sense of belonging through, on the fringes, I guess, maybe is the best way to put it. Yeah. And always kind of feeling like I didn't quite fit here, didn't quite fit there, but I had some friends that I could relate to over here with certain things. Like I had friends that I skated with, I had friends that I'd go to punk shows with, I had friends that I'd snowboard with, and there was some overlap there, but there was not necessarily always the same group. And so, yeah, I always kind of felt like I was kind of always on the fringes.
Yeah, I really love the way you describe that as being on the fringes. It's super, super relatable. My wife and I talk about this a lot, actually, because it was never for lack of, having a sense of, community, even in small pockets. Like I had a decent amount of friends through the sports that I played or the activities that I did, but it was like something viscerally inside of me felt like it didn't belong somewhere. And so it was like, what is the thing that's missing the connection that I'm craving, but I don't yet understand? And the fact that that sort of is where you're leading off, I think is really wonderful, because in the past few years, especially about 3 years ago, my mom passed away. But right before that, I was leaving a toxic relationship and I was really trying to find my way. And I actually started listening a lot to Alan Watts. And so like that became such a really important turning point for me with the ideas of Zen Buddhism and Taoism, and like really constructing sort of this sense of self through these ideas that seem very obvious as a human if we like allow ourselves the space to kind of feel through them and find our way in that. So yeah, if you want to expand a little bit more on sort of how that kind of culminated in where you got to.
Sure. So, I think that kind of remained true for a while. When I started college, I really had no idea what I was doing or no idea what direction to go in. Just taking, required classes and things, and didn't really figure out much direction until I think I went for either a year and a half, something like that, and then took time off. I had moved in the middle of my senior year from Idaho to Tennessee and had a bit of a culture shock there.
Yeah.
And so after about a year of college in Tennessee, I went back to Idaho, kind of took some time to just work and hang out with my friends and, go hiking and camping and rock climbing and do stuff like that. And over that time period, I had a couple of good friends from high school still who were starting to read stuff like Alan Watts, or like a couple of the books I remember from that time that were really sort of made an impact were like Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Shunryu Suzuki was a big one for me, I think. And there was a Chogyam Trungpa book, Shambhala, The Sacred Path of the Warrior, something like that. Couple of those that kind of started kind of getting me to look in that direction. And then, before long, it was like raiding the library for anything and everything to do with any kind of Eastern philosophy whatsoever. And I think that, and I think spending time in nature, I don't know that at the time I really understood what it was doing for me, but I think I always felt a sense of belonging in nature. Even if I could be by myself in nature or with a couple of friends in nature and feel like, just sitting here around the campfire or whatever, I belong. This is like, everything's fine. Everything's good with the world out here in nature. And then you get back into your daily life and jobs and everything, and everything can get all chaotic. So anyway, I got some direction there, went back to school, studied, did a Chinese studies program that was focused on, it was a interdisciplinary program that was Asian studies didn't have its own department. So it was like this interdisciplinary studies program that you take history classes or philosophy classes or language classes, from all different departments that had to do with your area of interest. And so that's really where I got some direction. Did that, and then life happened. At one point, I was going to go study in Hong Kong for a year. Instead, got engaged and sidetracked and never made it. And as these things happen, life happened, and anyway, eventually got through school. There were some more sidetracks in there.
Yeah, that's one of the hardest things is, I think, kind of even just navigating the path as you're maybe being thrown new experiences or opportunities, and you're making those choices very much in the moment with the information that you have in front of you, right? So it's like it might not be the way that we expect, but I think one of the things that I love just sort of about Taoism is sort of the acceptance of that. Yeah. And being able to give yourself the opportunity to just kind of go into those moments, like that sort of like radical presence. And that, you referred to it in another podcast that I watched with you around sort of like self-cultivation. I feel like that was such a great terminology.
Yeah. I liked one of my teachers liked to stress the idea of accepting and allowing. And by that, just accepting whatever the circumstances are, whatever is going on, just accept that is really happening. That is life. This moment is this moment, whether we want it to be this way or not. And allowing it to be what it is. And so, I mean, if we don't do that, if we're fighting with reality and we can't even accept it for what it is, it's like we're never gonna.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Make any progress or figure anything out, right? We're just going to be struggling and struggling. But if we can stop and go, okay, this is what's happening, and see things clearly, then we can at least have an inkling of knowing what we need to do or what direction we need to take.
For sure. And something I wanted to ask, because I know that being a forest therapy guide, obviously you're active in nature now. You're very much promoting like the benefit of being in nature and the way that we can connect sort of with ourselves and with the earth in that way. Have you always been somebody who gravitated towards that, the sort of the more outdoor natural world? Obviously you mentioned, in maybe your later teens, early 20s, having that sense of belonging and comfort there. But is that something that you always felt, or did you kind of land there over the years?
I think a little of both. I think I think I had that connection as a child and sort of forgot about it along the way. I think when I was Oh, I'm trying to think. Probably like early elementary kind of age. I think I spent a lot of time running around outside, and it was kind of like a neighborhood that was really kind of really had a lot of nature in it, and a lot of places where you could run through the woods, or you could, there'd be old kind of drainage ditchy kind of places where there were old stone foundations from some long forgotten house or something, and things like that. So where it was kind of like nature with some of that kind of history and almost like a mythological dimension to it, where when you're a kid and half of what your experience is in your imagination and half is reality around you. You're running around pretending to be
Yeah.
Peter Pan or something, right? Or you're playing some game, and half of it is a shared reality with your friends, where you're playing make believe, whatever.
Yeah.
And so you're imagining all these kind of things onto the landscape, but then you're also experiencing the natural world too, more than maybe we typically do as adults if we're not spending a lot of time out there. And so I think there was that element to it, and then I think I kind of forgot about that as I grew up and kind of lived in it wasn't that urban of an environment, but I mean, as a teenager, I lived in Boise, Idaho. It's not it's not a metropolis by any means, but I spent most of my time kind of in and around downtown, and so even though it was a small downtown, it was kind of more of an urban setting from that standpoint. And of course, skateboarding, that's what you're immersing
Yeah.
yourself in, right?
You're not really doing that in the
The
woods.
concrete jungle. Yeah, the concrete jungle, not the real jungle. So I think maybe having pulled myself out of nature for a while, that then I kind of needed to get back to it, and didn't really even realize it until I started doing activities that were taking me back out into nature. And then finding that sense of connection. And part of what I think drew me to like Eastern philosophy and stuff like that was like a lot of Chinese poetry, Japanese poetry is very nature oriented, right? And so I think I always found them very inspiring, and those settings and what they were talking about. And so that went along with the philosophy of religion and the whole kind of nature vibe of Taoism and Zen and stuff. And so I think that all kind of drew me back to nature a bit.
Yeah, I love that explanation. Thank you. And it's interesting to think about the juxtaposition of punk rock and sort of the ancient philosophy and poetry that you're describing. But I understand that because I'm very similar. I think that either way you look at it, there's this form of expression that resonates with us. And so when it comes to that evolution and where we're going in our lives, I think, sometimes you can kind of pinpoint, the song that you were listening to or the poem that you read, and go back to that moment and really sort of imbibe that feeling of who you were in that moment in time. And then, to come back to those things later in life and both have that reminiscent experience, but also really consider it in a new way, I think can be really fascinating, especially when you consider how you've become who you are through sort of micro moments like that, all just building up to create that who we are now and where we are now in our lives. So when you really made the decision to come into Taoism as something that, really spoke to you personally and professionally, what was the response, for people around you? Was this something that you felt like you had to kind of convince people of was like a reasonable life path, or was it sort of like you were very invested in it and people hopped on board?
It probably depends on at what point. So, I mean, that in and of itself was kind of a long, winding road as far as, I was doing that in college, but of course, like, when I was in college, my parents probably were like, oh yeah, China, you could take Chinese and do international business, that kind of a thing. Like, that sounds so practical and great. And I was like, yeah, I don't know that that's really what's gonna happen here. But eventually when I finished up, I ended up minoring in horticulture as well. And so for a while, I was working in landscaping, and then I was working in organic farming for a while. And so it was like the other side of things, as far as I was outside all day, every day, and, getting more than enough nature probably. And at some point it was like, okay, I'm not going to do this forever. And time to go back to school. And so that's when I went into acupuncture and did acupuncture school. And so that was kind of a way, I think, of being like Taoist adjacent,
Yeah.
as far as, there weren't a lot of opportunities to study Taoism other than in academia, do a master's in religious studies or something like that. But that wasn't really the path I wanted to take either. And so it was like, at the time, I think there were a lot of people probably who were kind of doing this to where, there weren't necessarily a lot of opportunities to strictly just study Taoism. But you could study a bunch of Taoist influenced things and stuff, and kind of Taoist adjacent things. And so Chinese medicine is kind of that way, in that it shares a lot of the same worldview, but it's not strictly speaking Taoist. Although, some of the famous physicians through Chinese history and stuff were Taoist priests and things like that. But probably just as many were Confucian scholars or whatever too. So so that was kind of a way of kind of stepping into that worldview, without taking off to a temple somewhere, and immersing myself that way. But and now, I mean, there are actually opportunities to do that. 20 years ago, that wasn't really an option so much, or maybe it was just barely starting to be. And so, I think during those years, I also studied with Buddhist teachers for a long time, when I was still in college, and then into acupuncture school, I guess, all through those years.
When you were,
and then what?
Oh, sorry, just a quick question. So, were you meeting people through your journey primarily through your academic endeavors who were associated sort of with, like you said, sort of learning from Buddhist teachers and things like that? Or were you cultivating a community of, obviously educators, but also people who were sort of in the similar space as you that were able to kind of relate on that and bring together your shared knowledge?
Yeah, probably a bit of both. I mean, in a lot of ways, a lot of it was a solitary journey as far as what I was reading and what I was thinking about and what was influencing me. When I was still in college, and college was an off and on long time period for me. But it's when I started to spend time with different Buddhist groups and stuff. And, first I was doing some practicing with some Zen groups that weren't particularly close. So it was kind of a long haul. So every once in a while, I was in part of the time I was living in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And so it was about an hour down to Atlanta to go to the Zen Center down there. So occasionally I'd make that trip, or later on, I was in Knoxville, and so it was kind of a longer haul. So that didn't happen too often. But then once I was in Knoxville, I kind of started hanging out with the Buddhist groups there more. That was a Tibetan Buddhist group that I spent time with for several years.
How did you find them to begin with? Were you just kind of like, I'm actively looking for this, and therefore, just kind of uncovering that these groups existed there?
I think that was it, really. It was kind of like, okay, this is all the stuff I'm reading. This is all that I'm interested in. The internet was alive then enough that you could kind of start to find things, or you'd see flyers and stuff like that, right? So this group, I think how they started originally was back when they would do those tours. The monks would tour to put on performances, basically, of they had the chanting that sounds like the Mongolian, like multi-tonal kind of chanting. And they had the big horns, and they'd do some of the Lama dances and stuff like that. So when they were doing those tours, This probably would have been in, mid 90s, I guess, maybe something like that. Yeah, they were kind of doing those tours, and people who were interested, I guess, were probably helping host the monks and stuff. And then I think that center kind of grew out of that connection initially. And then I think, I think that's where it really grew out of. And then I think they're still going strong. I think they've been there ever since. But
yeah, it's really fascinating to just kind of think about how this is something that is a widely known concept. These are what you're describing, Taoism, Zen Buddhism, all of the practices, that are more Eastern. We've seen them come to the Western world. We've done whatever we've done with them, I guess, for good, for better and for worse, probably in some ways. But it's really, I think, reaffirming to recognize that there are people who, want to help others connect with that side of them. And what you've done, from what I understand with your book, I haven't had a chance to read it yet, 100 Remedies of the Tao, is like to really take pieces of what you've learned and simplify it in a way that makes sense for the modern world, for just sort of any person who might come in and be like, I want to know more, but I need it to be able to feel maybe more applicable to my everyday life. Was that sort of the mindset behind creating this book?
Yeah, for sure. It's like I wanted to. I think that was probably half of it, or 2/3, let's say. I definitely wanted to make it practical, make it relatable to anybody that was interested in their spiritual life, whether they were specifically interested in Taoism or not. I think a lot of people could read this and find a lot of food for thought and a lot of things to relate to, as long as they were interested in anything that was kind of to do with meditation, mindfulness, any of those sorts of things, right? That you're going to find relatable things. I also tried to introduce more Taoist concepts and ideas than are typically in mainstream readership kind of books about Taoism. Just there've been so many rehashings of the Tao Te Ching just over and over. There's like a new translation every day, right? And it's like, okay, we might have had enough of those now.
Right,
maybe,
right.
just maybe. Although that being said, one of the newest translations that has just come out is probably one of the best. I don't know.
It's interesting too. I actually feel like the timing of this conversation is so great because my wife had mentioned to me maybe a couple of weeks ago that she had listened to one of the Wayne Dyer readings of Tao Te Ching, and for the first time, and I had previously listened to it as well, but it was very top of mind with like the sort of, like you said, it's people who are in the mindset. Where are you right now? Like, what is it that you're seeking, to glean from that? But I think there's also something really wonderful about kind of going in without like really seeking to gain anything, and just trying to, I guess seeking to understand, right? Like, just to learn more. And then it's something that I think when you consume it, it feels so obvious. It's like everybody should consume this in one way or another because it's just so reasonable. And so I find it really interesting to just kind of, I guess I haven't really thought about the various interpretations of it and how that sort of manifests across the way that people are actually, taking those lessons or taking those learnings and applying them. So it's like you can take sort of the base text and cultivate something that's more specific, or you can sort of look at it for what it's worth and in that moment from that interpretation and just let that sort of be your purview of it.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's interesting in that a lot of the text in the Tao Te Ching is probably originally little sayings or almost like little verses that were kind of collected and compiled together. And then at some point they kind of tried to make it into something that seemed like it had been written all in one go.
Right.
And I think in that way, those almost like lines of poetry sort of, and in that way, it's almost like a song in the sense that I mean, some of the greatest songs are songs that anybody can listen to and find something that they resonate with and they relate to, and
For sure.
everybody feels like, oh, this song is speaking about my life, and it's like, and maybe the person who wrote it like was thinking about something very, very different when they wrote it, and that's what they put into it, and that's what they were kind of resonating with, right? But so I think the more varied viewpoints and different directions people can come from and find something in there that they relate to, the more appealing something like that can be. And so, and the Tao Te Ching is a little bit vague as well, partly just being written in ancient Chinese. The language is not as specific as like modern English would be or something. And so there is a lot of room for interpretation, even if you are trying to stay very accurate to the worldview and the times when it was written and all of that, you can still have all kinds of interpretations. And so that ability makes it very, very flexible, very appealing to anybody, because you can read, you can project all kinds of things into it.
Yeah.
And you'll pull all kinds of things out of it that weren't there or weren't originally intended or whatever. And that's part of the beauty of the book.
Do you
and
feel
at the
like,
same time,
oh, I'm sorry, continue. You can go.
No, I was going to say, and then you have, at the same time, that's also allowed people to just feel like they can just do whatever they want with it, kind of too, and get a little wild on their interpretations and stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So I'm just curious, have you had moments where you've, let's say, read or listened to any of these things and these learnings at different points in your life and felt that you've gleaned different things from them?
Yeah, I'm sure it has. And even just over a shorter time period, I think one thing that's great about texts like these that are relatively short, and there are a lot of Taoist texts that are much, much shorter, like ones that are part of the liturgies and stuff like that are quite short. They would just be a couple pages.
Well, I like the bite-sized pieces of information. In this day and age, I think that's like a good segue for people. Like, just try it and see how it goes from there.
Yeah, for sure. And so that's like for the book, the commentaries. I mean, the remedies themselves are basically a sentence, right? And then the commentaries are only, at the most 2-3 pages, maybe a few a little bit longer than that, but they're pretty much little concise bite-sized pieces. But with these short texts that are kind of they're kind of straightforward, but kind of not. So they definitely benefit from repeated reading. And so things that are like in a liturgy where you're hearing it over and over and over, you'll have times when it means nothing new to you, and then all of a sudden you'll hear it and it's like you heard it for the first time, and like you make some new connection with something else you read or heard, or something that's happened in your life, and all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, wow, like
you're totally right. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
even song lyrics to your earlier mention. I think there are things that I listen to now years later after I've heard them for the first time. I'm like, oh, that hits different now. Like something in life has occurred and now it makes more sense to me, or it feels more relatable. So I love that you mentioned that. Yeah,
there's a lot of things like that we can understand and know intellectually, and we'll hear them when we're kind of like, yeah, I get it. And then, maybe our life conditions are more like maybe the person who wrote the song or that stage of their life or something. And then it's like a whole different ballgame.
Totally.
Like,
I feel like,
okay, now I really get it.
Yeah. I feel like that's a lot of times when I'm in therapy, the moment that I have where I'm like, no, I rationally understand, for, certain moments in my life and I can say, I get it. I rationally know that. I'm still working through the emotional side of it. And then all of a sudden, you know, like you have this revelation and you're like, oh no, I get it now though, like on a much deeper level. So it is sort of trying to find that, that meeting point between your rational brain and your emotional, spiritual side that like actually really kind of brings it all together in a way that, as you said, just sort of makes it stick that time.
Yeah, I think so. And then, you know, unfortunately, we have times where we will have a realization that we've already had realized that before,
Yeah.
or like you're like, oh, that's right, I used to know this, and I somehow over the years it had just evaporated, and now I've had to relearn this lesson again. But
Yeah.
fortunately, I've learned it, and hopefully this will be the last time. But
Yeah.
probably
It's
not.
like, remember that.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, so I think that can be helpful too with certain books or certain songs or things in your life that you come back to over and over, because hopefully they can kind of remind you on a semi-regular basis about some of these realizations or lessons learned or whatnot that you'll have through your life. And hopefully those laps will you know, come a little more frequent, and some of that will stick. I know with myself, I feel like I have a strange memory that if I'm not actively engaged with something, I feel like it just vanishes, you know. And then I often realize that, oh wait, I still know that stuff. It's just that it doesn't seem to be in my conscious
Yeah, it's not the
day-to-day
prominent
mind.
thought. Yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
I feel like it seems like just sort of based on the nature of the way you're speaking about your life and the things that have factored into you becoming who you are and landing where you are in life, is that there is a lot of input. So to try to retain all of that at a level that is always accessible is very challenging. So sometimes it sort of pops in when you need it. Other times you're like, as you said, you sort of maybe have your memory of it or your implementation of it is sort of not yet recovered. And so I find that, you know, as I've evolved personally, that those things that, you know, the inputs, as you said, they're still there. Like our subconscious knows that we know these things. And so it might actually even be impacting the way we're living our day-to-day lives. We're just not conscious of the fact that we're letting these things continue to impact what we're doing or the way that we show up in the world. Do you feel like that's sort of similar? So, I mean, subconsciously, that is literally how it works. But I guess for your own life, have you felt that way?
Yeah, I think so. And you'll have times, I think, where even if you're not aware of it, you're allowing that to come through and shape things. And you'll have other times where you're trying to do something that maybe isn't as authentic to you or isn't as in line with, you know, who you are. And it'll feel like that much more of a struggle and things. And then when you get more in alignment again with those parts of you that are still there but are kind of not conscious, that things just seem to flow much better. So
I'm going to bring it to something that I mentioned in the intro, which is that you're a Taoist priest. What does that entail for you in sort of your day-to-day life or overall practice?
Well, so for me, it has been a way of just diving deeper into the practice. It's not, I haven't, you know, started my own temple, and I'm not like doing rituals for people every day or something like that. But it was a way of, it was just I think a way of deepening the practice, wanting to know more, and it'll be a long journey. I tend to think of these things as like, you're just going to be on a journey until you die. You know, it's like, it's not like you're not going to get anywhere. You know, you're just going to keep waking up and continuing on until you don't. So
yeah.
But a lot of the ritual side of Taoism is really complicated, and so years and years and years of study. And so I've just kind of dipped my toe in that compared to people who have done it for a lifetime. But yeah, I just I did a kind of like a seminary type program when I wanted to deepen my studies, and found a teacher who was doing that kind of a thing, and did that, and then have just continued on with other teachers as well. And so yeah, just never ending
Yeah.
never ending journey. But I think there was always a part of me that wanted to dive deeper into things, and that was a way of doing that, I think.
Yeah. And I appreciate the desire to find ways to deepen that practice. I think a lot of us like the idea of many things. I can speak to myself for sure. And, it's sort of the generalized or like just a lighter commitment to it and just wanting to understand, but not necessarily going to that next stage of, really implementing the practice and being intentional about it. I mean, to be honest with you, I know nothing about Taoist rituals. I don't, now I'm curious for sure, which is good. That's always one of my favorite things about doing this show is just learning more about what I don't actually know. And I wonder, how your practice with Taoism and the work that you're doing as a forest therapy guide, like, I clearly there's some intersection, sort of from the natural side of things, but was that something that you felt like very intentional about bringing those things together?
I think I always intuitively felt like they were very complementary,
Mm-hmm.
and that there should be a natural overlap there. And I think it's taken me a few years to kind of distill that to what I sort of want it to look like, or what it actually looks like for me, or will look like. And so it's like, on the one hand, it makes perfect sense that, I mean, practices like Qigong and stuff like that, traditionally people do them outside whenever they can. That's why you have all the old people in parks in China, out there doing Tai Chi and Qigong and stuff like that.
Can
I
I
mean,
ask you,
partly,
I actually don't know what
yeah.
Qigong is. Could you explain that?
Okay. So it's kind of the modern iteration of practices that go back a long way, couple thousand years probably at least. And so it's on the one hand, it's similar to something like yoga. It's a little bit more like it looks typically a little bit more like Tai Chi as far
Okay.
as the movement of it. Um, there are seated forms of these things, and styles that are more like what we think of with yoga, with asanas and stuff, more stretching involved and things like that. And then a lot of it is typically done standing, though,
Okay.
and the movements tend to be more rounded and more flowing than yoga. And it's similar in that you're wanting your energetic part of yourself to be flowing. On the
Mm.
one hand, you're talking about your breath and your circulation, and then you may or may not be thinking about an energetic component to it. So in that way, it's very analogous to yoga. It's obviously has different roots, although I think there was probably some medieval overlapping and stuff
Yeah.
along the Silk Road, I'm sure.
Well, thank
Stuff
you for
like that.
explaining
But
that.
sure. But so yeah, and going back to Chinese medicine and acupuncture, um, there's the idea of being in harmony with nature for your health, following natural cycles and things like that. And so Qigong is stressed in those arenas, and as for health, it's a like a longevity practice, or a health maintenance kind of practice. You can think of it that way. And so it seems like, oh, if you're trying to be in alignment with nature and natural cycles and live a more natural life and do all these things, well, hey, that makes perfect sense, and goes right along with kind of the goals of something like forest therapy. Yeah, so it seemed like, oh, sure, there's a natural overlap there. But then I think when I initially trained in forest therapy, I didn't want to feel like, oh, I'm just going to play kind of fast and loose and just throw things together and do whatever. Because I kind of tend to feel like I want to really know something well enough to know what is sort of essential and vital in a practice, or in a tradition, or what have you, before I kind of want to play fast and loose and just feel like you can just take it and do whatever you want with it, and that's kind of the problem with
Yeah.
a lot of things today is people just go, oh yeah, that looks cool. I'll just take a little this, a little that, and just throw it together and market it, and it's a whole new thing now, and I can slap a brand on it and whatever. So,
well, I respect the integrity. I do. I very much do. Because I think it speaks especially to just sort of the desire to have that connection personally. Like, this is what's important for you, and then to share that benefit with other people. It's wanting to make sure that they have the depth of understanding and the connection to it as well, as opposed to just sort of like putting something out there for commercial purposes, which, I mean, it's really a shame. And that so much of that happens. If I have to find a silver lining, I think that it would be that there's at least exposure to some of these schools of thought, maybe that there wouldn't have been if people weren't doing that. But I really admire that, like, there's that element of integrity for you, because you'd mentioned when we first started chatting a little bit about sort of having things in alignment with who you are and where you are. And the term that comes up for me so frequently anymore is just this idea of being in congruence with who you are and like the things that are happening in your life, and getting you to a place where like you can feel like you're in that flow and that you are accepting and allowing, but you're also intentional about what you're doing. And the way that you're speaking to your practice, I feel like really emulates that.
Yeah, for sure. It's yeah. There's a lot there. I think it's important that I mean, so often when we start to chase things too much, as far as like I've got to figure out how to commodify this and like do something with it, and like so much of our life is geared towards that we need times too when we are doing things for the sake of doing them, and not because there's something to get out of it, like some I mean, we need money, we need to feed and clothe ourselves and house ourselves and all that good stuff, but
it's the plight of humanity.
yeah unless we change our systems dramatically, and have very different sort of values throughout society, then that's always going to be that struggle between those.
I think about that often.
Things,
I feel like it seems like it should be so much easier than we make it. It's almost like what you were saying with sort of having, if we have this resistance to things, we make it so much more difficult. I feel like as a society, like as humanity, we're functioning a bit from that space where it's like, if we just gave ourselves like the most simplistic view of the world, and we thought about how we can, align more with nature within ourselves, create more communities that are rooted in these, I think, very important beliefs that like aren't tied to, just some sort of standardized religion, but to just really more the philosophical side of things. If humanity operated more from like a philosophical good, I feel like we would be in a vastly different place. I feel like I'm a hopeless romantic for humanity is what I would describe it as. It's like I have this vision of what could be, and it's like, but be real, and it's like, come on, be better. Sorry, that's a little bit of a tangent, but I just feel like, when you speak about the commoditization of things, it's like, it really just hits where it's like, we should be doing things because that's what feels right. And then, if there's sort of this additional benefit to it, great. But when we drive from that place of, I mean, ultimately, I think a lot of people just want stability, but there is also so much greed in this world that it's so fundamentally different than the practices that you're describing too. It's like, I don't know that I can believe that somebody who is a billionaire and wants to talk about how like they have, these very, sound philosophical practices. You're like, I don't think that works, right? Like that doesn't feel like that's incongruence, perhaps. But do you feel like the work that you're doing is something that is really rooted in, because I know you mentioned really going down this path to kind of uncover things for yourself. Now that you've gotten to a place where you are, a therapy guide, do you feel like you're coming more from a place of service and a desire to like expand into, help other people expand their journeys?
Yeah, I think so. And I think I've always come from that place a little bit, and it's always evolved what that has meant for me and how that's been expressed. Um, but yeah, I think it really is weird that, I mean, I share your view basically of a very optimistic view of humanity in the long run, and that, most people just want to be happy and comfortable and leave, leave a good life to their kids and all that kind of thing, right? And, leave the world better than they found it kind of thing. But then, unfortunately, we always have a segment of the population of the world that sees the world as very like dog eat dog, and like that we're
Transactional.
always in, yeah, well, transactional, and also like viewing everything as a head-to-head competition or something, and that they need to win and someone else has to lose for them to win, and that kind of thing, as opposed to, as the world keeps getting smaller and we keep getting more and more interconnected, it's like at a certain point, can't we see all of humanity as our community and our group that we're wanting to succeed, right? And
Oh my God, I love that you said that, Greg. Like I feel seen. Like I really do. Because
can't we want everybody to flourish, right? Like,
it's like yes, 1,000% yes. I'm constantly in this, I feel like, looping conversation with whoever will let me talk to them about it, because I'm like, I really feel strongly that it is possible for all of us to succeed. And I would equate it to my experience in the corporate world, which is you have people who are just sort of the ladder climbers, the empire builders is what people would call them at these companies. And it's like all you care about is building up the specific circumstances around you to get you where you want to go. And so you'll sort of crush the people below you to rise on your own, instead of realizing if you empowered those people, you would all rise. And really, there's no problem with everybody being successful. But like for some people, I think it's, I mean, realistically, it's just such an ego-based way of thinking and operating. So it's really helpful to know that other people think this way. Greg, thank you for validating this for me.
Sure, for sure. Yeah, it's funny. I remember hearing things like they would ask people whether they would rather make, I don't remember what the specific numbers were, but let's say, would you rather make $100,000 at your job, but everybody else makes 150,000, or would you rather make 50,000 at a job that everybody else makes 20,000? And people would want to have the higher pay in relation to their peers and not the actual highest pay they could have. And it just like made no sense. It's like you'd just rather be comparing yourself to other people or feel like you're winning in comparison to them as opposed to doing better, period.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. That's a good way of describing it.
Yeah. It's so weird. It's like, yeah. And I think there's this weird, paradox, I think, to where the more we're looking out at other people and comparing ourselves to them and making judgments, the more egotistical we become, even though in a sense, it's like we're spending all our time looking out, but it's causing us to sort of solidify all that egotism and self-centeredness even more. Versus, if we're looking in first and figuring things out, figuring out who we are, trying to live an authentic life ourselves, then we don't really care what the other people are doing. They can be doing whatever they want, and we're doing our thing. And so in a sense, we've become more egotistical, but it's like in a positive way, right? So there's always this weird paradox that if we look at ourselves, often we'll become less egotistical
Yeah.
than than when we look outward. So it's I mean, ideally, we're probably doing both.
To kind of go a little bit further on that, it makes me think about how, well, it's sort of like, what's the intention of the going inward, right? Of the focusing on yourself. Because I think, obviously, as we've established in this conversation and throughout life, that you have to prioritize yourself. You have to figure out who you are. You have to understand yourself to be able to show up in the world in that way, that authentic way that you're talking about. And I think it's reasonable to recognize that, situations and people around us will impact, the way that we do that. And it's our choice if it's going to be in that, through that lens of comparison. Or maybe we can look at that. And I'm saying this as if I don't need to hear it too, but I'm saying it for myself as well, which is that it's also, what if you just look at that and, as you said, sort of acknowledge what other people are doing more as a matter of fact? And maybe it's an input into the way that you show up and what you do, but it's not in a way that is comparative and then either therefore like motivating you through sort of more egotistical means, or maybe demotivating you because you feel this sense of shame or powerlessness or something like that. So it's like, there's so much of it is that perspective that you hold when you're focusing on yourself that really kind of turns it to like I don't even want to say like good or bad or positive or negative, but that's sort of it, right? Like, it's like, is it more because I just am observing, or is it because I'm trying to observe and then activate something within myself?
Yeah. And we can look to other people to learn things, of course, and positive or negative. We can look at other people and be like, wow, I really don't want to do what they're doing.
Totally.
And we can look at other people and say, oh, I'm doing pretty well because look at that person over there. Not in terms of, material gain or things like that, but just like, how are we doing as a person? Like, just how are we doing in our lives? We can look to others and say, oh, I'm glad I'm not doing that. I'm glad I don't need to learn those lessons, or I have already learned those lessons. And you can look to other people as examples of things you want to emulate, and this could be mentors or it could even be strangers that you treat as mentors, in the sense that they are a good example to follow.
Yeah, that's great.
And, hopefully they're in your life and you can have a more direct relationship. But even if they're not, they can just be somebody that, you use as a role model, as a guide out there. Like, hey, and even if they're not a perfect person, like none of us really are, they may be very together in an aspect of their life. And you can say, ooh, on this other side of this person's life, they're not so together, but they've really got this part figured out. And so I'm going to take that. I'm going to emulate that part of them.
Yeah.
And then you can do and you can maybe use that other side of them as the negative example. Like, I'm not going to do that, but I am going to do that.
Yeah. Well, I feel like our entire lives are basically kind of doing that in maybe not as deliberate of a way, and sort of mixing and matching our experiences to speaking about my experience in corporate jobs. I just think about, you sort of see the manager, like we're all working for the machine at that point. So you've got the people who are like really intentional about like building a team that's unified, that they want, all boats to rise together, and they're doing the best they can in the circumstances they have. And I can say like those people were very helpful in cultivating the way I show up in a professional workspace and things like that. And then there's the other people where you're like, I don't want to be like you. Like, I have no desire to show up that way. And the best thing that I can hope for sometimes in situations like that, whether it's professionally or personally, is to maybe ideally take those things that we learned that are more positive, that feel more right to us, that feel more aligned. And when I say more positive, I mean like you're not trying to harm somebody. You're not being completely self-serving. Like you're coming from a place of just genuine desire to be who you are, to help other people in some way. And it's like, if we can embody that in a more meaningful way, then maybe we can also help influence those people that we don't really want to be like, some people are stubborn and they're not going to be open to that. And maybe some of it has to be like, feel maybe a little covert and just kind of like be the way that you want to be and hope that that kind of rubs off on some people. But I do feel like there's this really important factor of identifying, the things that we want to keep and the things that we want to leave behind. And, it sounds like throughout your life and on this journey that you've been on, Greg, that you've really done a lot of interesting work and self-development and really kind of pulled together the things that feel right to you. So do you feel like you're at a point right now where you're kind of like riding the wave and seeing where it's going? Or do you have something sort of on the docket for where you want to go next?
Yeah, I think a little of both. I'm a little bit writing at the moment. I think transitioning into is there a next book coming? Is there am I going to focus a little bit more on the forest therapy and growing that side of things a little bit more? And then there's just who knows what life is going to throw at you, right? And so I've got a couple daughters, and a lot of life is centered around whatever's
They'll
going
keep you
on with
busy.
them. And yeah, for sure. So there's all that stuff in the mix too, family life and that good stuff. So much of life is just figuring out having that intentional kind of finding your purpose, that kind of stuff, right? And then we either do that by trying things that seem like they're aligned with, if we have an idea of what we think that is, or we try all kinds of random things and we go, that's not it, that's not it,
Yeah.
not it. I did a lot of that along the way, I think, too, with a lot of strange jobs and things. It's, again, in hindsight, it's like it kind of all makes sense to some extent, and seems to be flowing together in a certain direction. So I think that's part of what got me into writing books was, I enjoyed the process, but also wanting to, make a bigger impact than I could make one-on-one with people, just in an acupuncture practice or what have you. And so, that's always been a part of it.
Yeah. Well, as we're rounding out the episode here, is there anything that you'd like to share with listeners, particularly around either Taoism in general or your book, that you feel would be something that would be, maybe inspiring might not be the right word, but might resonate with people, particularly if they haven't really had a chance or made the decision to dive into learning about Taoism yet? Like, where would you maybe suggest that they start?
Well, I think maybe I'll focus on that overlap of nature and Taoism is where I kind of find myself so often. And so, I wrote an earlier book that was called Taoist Sustainability, and that was kind of the focus of that, was more nature connection focus.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the impetus was wanting people to have options for healthier lifestyles and all of that. Part of it is, dealing with climate change and what we're heading into here. Because I really feel like the crux of it is just that disconnection we have with nature and natural cycles. And we've become so divorced from the natural world that we kind of just don't notice these things happening in our daily lives, right? We're focused on our jobs, we're focused online, we're focused inside all the time, and we're not in touch with what's going on. And so, we take care of what we are aware of. And if we keep sort of disconnected like this, it's just inevitably things will get worse. But I feel like we have all the tools, we have all the current technology, we have everything we need to go in a different direction, and we just don't really seem to have the political will or enough momentum to combat that greediness and that other side of things. The people who are wanting to hoard and wanting to win at the cost of the rest of the world and all of that. And so, yeah, I think that's the most important focus for all of us right now is seeing that unity of humanity and realizing that it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. It doesn't have to be head-to-head competition over a scrap of land or some resources or whatever. There's more than enough to go around. We've got to take care of each other.
I love that. I think that's a perfect way to end the episode. I could not agree with you more. So thank you so much, Greg. It has been so great to chat with you. And gang, you can get Greg's book, 100 Remedies of the Tao, Spiritual Wisdom for Interesting Times, on Amazon. I believe it's also at Barnes & Noble. You can check out his website, gregoryripley.com. All of that stuff will be in the show notes. And thank you again so much, Greg. It was great having you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Gang, thanks so much for joining me for this week's episode. I just appreciate your support, and it means so much to me that you tune in week after week. The best thing that you can do to help spread the word about the podcast is, if this episode resonated with you, go ahead and share it with somebody else wherever you listen to your podcasts, or you can go ahead and subscribe to my YouTube channel and share it from there. I also really appreciate it if you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts, because that really helps give people a better understanding of what the show's about and what you appreciate about the conversations that we're having. And until then, I'll catch you on the flip side.